In 605 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the kingdom of Judah and took the Jewish people captive from their land. The great temple of Yahweh was pillaged, the finest treasures taken back to Babylon, and an end put to any hope of independence for the foreseeable future. And yet, exactly 70 years later, in 536 BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great would liberate the Jews from exile, returning them to Judah and re-establishing their state. So, how did Babylon go from being a tyrannical oppressor to liberator within one generation? Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to answer this extraordinary question by exploring how Babylon went from tyrant to liberator in just 70 years. If you enjoy learning about ancient history, then please subscribe. When the Babylonians came into conflict with the kingdom of Judah, they were at the height of their power. Having displaced the Assyrians as the dominant Mesopotamian empire, they were now masters of a vast domain that stretched from the mountains of Iran down to the Arabian Peninsula and from the Aegean Sea to the borders of Egypt. But it was in their treatment of the Jews and their homeland that the Babylonian Empire would earn its infamous reputation. After conquering Judah, Nebuchadnezzar decided the region's fate. He deported the elite class of Jerusalem, including the royal line of David, and replaced them with people loyal to the Babylonian crown. As punishment for their rebellion, he also destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the great temple of Yahweh. But even after these punitive measures, discontented Jews continued to rebel against their oppressors. Finally, in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had enough. He marched on Jerusalem a third time, burnt the city again, destroyed more of the temple, and deported even more of the population, including the prophet Ezekiel. A small remnant stayed behind, but their lives were far from ideal. We get our best description of Babylonian rule through the book of Nehemiah, which begins with the Israelites still smarting under the oppressive yoke of their oppressors. In chapter 1, verses 3 to 4, it says, "I sat down and began to weep and mourn over Jerusalem. Then some friends of mine and some of my fellow servants said, 'Why should you not eat and drink and be glad? It's a festive day before the king.' They were all in good spirits and sent me a choice young goat, but I went down to the palace courtyard and sat down in front of the gate. I took the water in a clay jug and threw it into the garden. Then I went on to the wall and inspected it." This wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Over the next 4 years, Nehemiah fixed up the gates and repaired the wall around the city, but his work was far from done. The Babylonian Empire didn't last much longer. In 539 BC, it was conquered by Persia. The famous account comes from the book of Daniel, chapters 5 and 6. And though historians debate the historicity of certain parts of the narrative, there's no doubt that Babylon fell in this time frame. The story goes like this. Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, hosted a great feast, inviting the nobles of the kingdom along with their wives and their daughters. At some point in the evening, they began mocking the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And, as judgment, the finger of God wrote on the wall of the palace. Horrified, Belshazzar summoned Daniel, who interpreted the writing as a divine message, foretelling the end of the Babylonian royal line that very night. That same night, while the revelry was still in full swing, an army of Medes and Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, stormed the city, killing Belshazzar and looting the royal palace. But here's where things take a surprising turn. Instead of subjugating the Jews, Cyrus treated them quite well. In fact, he became known as a liberator, allowing the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild their temple. The most famous edict granting them permission is called the Cyrus Cylinder, traditionally dated to 539 BC, inscribed on the clay cylinder are decrees about a number of topics, including the restoration of temples, the release of slaves, and the right of manumission, and the return of exiles. However, recent scholarship puts the date of this document closer to 509 BC, This would fit better with what the book of Ezra tells us about the Jewish exiles. Ezra chapter 1 verse 1 to 4. Now in the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, that Cyrus who had been told in the citadel and throughout his whole realm, that there was a remnant of the children of Israel left there, and that they might return and rebuild the temple of Yah, the God of Israel, he sent out a decree, which was carried out with diligence, and he allowed them to return. Thus the decree of Cyrus, king of Persia, concerning the temple of God, it was made known to all the peoples near and far. And all the kings of the countries commanded all those who had been carried away captive by him to return to their places, every one to his city. And who were you, O king? And let the God of heaven help you, and rebuild the temple of Jerusalem, so that you may have a shrine of prayer for your God. For thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the god of Babylon, has sent me to destroy it, and to overthrow it, and to disperse the inhabitants thereof among the nations, and to be a curse to those who would not allow the restoration of this city. Thus far, all my power and my dominion. Now Cyrus, the Persian, liberates the Jews. Why? Well, there are a few reasons. First, Cyrus had a personal interest in the welfare of the Jews. Second, he wanted to present himself as a liberator to win favor with the God of Israel. Third, he benefited from having a grateful and loyal group of people settled back in Judah. As for the first reason, there's no evidence that Cyrus ever personally persecuted the Jews. In fact, everything we know about his attitude towards the Jews comes from sources that are favorable to Cyrus. Granted, the book of Isaiah does contain a prophecy about a Cyrus who will come out of Media, gather the Jews from their scattered midst, and bring them to their own land. But the exact nature of Cyrus's relationship to the Jews is unclear. Most scholars think Cyrus acted favorably towards the Jews because he respected their God, Yahweh, and there are several stories that could explain his change of heart. One popular idea is that Daniel predicted Cyrus's victory over Babylon, and therefore the future Persian king was indebted to the God of Israel for his success. Another possibility is that Cyrus witnessed the righteous behavior of the Jews during their exile and was won over by their piety. Finally, it's possible that Cyrus's wife, Esther, who was Jewish, had an influence on his decisions. We don't have much information about her, but she was influential enough to save the Jews from genocide when the evil Haman plotted to annihilate them. The story of Esther is itself fascinating, and I highly recommend reading it. Setting aside these stories, it seems that Cyrus admired the monotheism of the Jews, and while there's no evidence that he converted to Judaism, he clearly understood the difference between Yahweh and the gods of Babylon. In fact, he is the first non-Jewish leader that we know of who actually bothered to restore the temple of Yahweh. Our second reason for Cyrus' propaganda, if you will. He liked to present himself as a liberator. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he immediately issued edicts freeing slaves, restoring property, and reuniting families. He may have done this to differentiate himself from the brutal kings of Babylon, like Nebuchadnezzar, who built his empire on conquest and pillage. More than that, though it seems that Cyrus believed he was doing the will of God when he freed the Jews. Remember the Cyrus cylinder? It reads, "I am Cyrus, king of the world, the anointed of the Lord." He is claiming that Yahweh has appointed him to overthrow the Babylonians and reinstate the Jews in their homeland. Now, whether or not he genuinely believed that Yahweh spoke directly to him is up for debate. But what's clear is that Cyrus wanted to associate himself with the God of Israel. And what better way to do so than to return the Jews to their home and help them rebuild their magnificent temple? Which brings us to our final reason. Practicality. Cyrus benefited greatly from having a grateful and loyal group of people settled in Judah. See, Babylon was an extremely diverse empire. It contained people from dozens of different cities and nations. To maintain control over such a diverse population, Cyrus needed allies. The Jews were perfect subjects for him to court. Not only were they numerous, having been increased in population during their time in exile, they were organized, disciplined, and shared a common culture and language. By treating them well, Cyrus could expect their loyalty and support in running his vast empire, and this alliance paid off. After the fall of Babylon, Cyrus ruled over an even larger area than his predecessors ever did, conquering Thrace in the west and parts of Central Asia in the east. To conclude, we must admit that the transition from tyrannical oppressor to liberator was a complicated process, both in reality and in the eyes of the Jews. While Cyrus did allow the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild their temple, the reality of life under the Persians was mixed. For one thing, Cyrus wasn't the only Persian king. His successors weren't as keen on championing the rights of the Jews, and there are several stories in the books of Nehemiah and Esther about anti-Jewish decrees. Furthermore, many Jews never returned to the land of Judah. Some remained in Babylon, and many others settled in the region around the Persian Empire. Still, given the circumstances, the Persian kings were relatively tolerant of the Jews, and allowed them to govern themselves according to their laws. And it's hard to deny that Cyrus deserves credit for turning things around. Through a combination of personal experience, divine revelation, and political he became the liberator of the Jews and a legendary figure in Jewish history. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Be sure to subscribe and leave me a comment. And as always, thanks for watching.